Hello, I'm Peter Borgen, librarian at the Hamline Midway Library in St. Paul, Minnesota. This is our 27th year of hosting the Fireside Reading Series, and we are thrilled to be able to carry on the tradition even in this unusual year. I am pleased to welcome you to the Fireside Reading Series from our fireside. If you are here, we would love to offer you cookies and coffee or tea, and we would all squeeze into our children's area for the evening to listen to great writers read from their books and talk with them about their work. Obviously, this year is different, and we are happy that you have chosen to join us in this new format to carry on our long tradition. Tonight, we are happy to feature Margi Preus with her book, Village of Scoundrels. The St. Paul Public Libraries have copies of our featured authors' works available for contactless hold pickup at the Hamline Midway Library location or via Library Express at our other library locations. You can find out all the details at www.sppl.org. I hope you are cozy wherever you are and that you enjoy tonight's event. Thank you for spending time with us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Fireside Reading Series event. I am Wendy Worden, with the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. I'm the Programs and Services Assistant. And as we get started this evening, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, Indigenous keepers of the land from which I broadcast tonight. This land was reserved by the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow Indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe peoples are the original stewards of stories in this place now called Minnesota, and we at the Friends honor that tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state today. Our main event this evening is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. We're so grateful for your support and your presence here this evening. We will begin with a reading and then open things up to questions from you. And we will follow up with a brief survey to get your feedback, so do be on the lookout for that. We have partnered with Next Chapter Bookseller in St. Paul, and you could also get the book at Red Balloon because that has a special history, as I'm sure Margi and Nelly will get into. And as Peter said, we are pleased to have Margi Preus and Nelly Hewitt with us this evening. Margi is the New York Times best-selling author of the Newbery Honor book, Heart of a Samurai, and other notable books for young readers, including the Minnesota Book Award-winning West of the Moon. Her books have been honored as ALSC Notables, selected as an NPR Backseat Book Club pick, chosen for community reads, and translated into several languages. New in 2020 are The Village of Scoundrels, The Silver Box, and The Littlest Voyageur, which was now a finalist for this year's Minnesota Book Award in middle grade literature. Margi is joining us from Duluth. Our other guest this evening is Nelly Truckman Hewitt. She is the daughter of Andre and Magda Truckman, who were instrumental in the rescue and sheltering effort in the village of Le Chambon-sur-Lyon. Nelly can take me to task for my terrible French. Nelly grew up in the village and was a teenager during World War II. She lives in St. Paul and was an invaluable resource in the creation of Village of Scoundrels. So welcome to you both. I'm so pleased that you could join us this evening.
Thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me to this and Nelly to the Fireside Reading Series. There's a fire, which my footman might be coming in to stoke it now and then. Pay no attention to him.
A footman is your husband.
Yes, also my husband. Okay. And Nelly's been introduced. Thank you, Wendy, for the introduction. So I don't need to follow up with that, but I will say that because of Nelly, I was able to write this book. She introduced me to pretty much everyone that I was able to interview for the book, many of whom became characters in the book. And she gave me a letter of introduction to the village in France, where I was able to meet many people and go to the museum and see some homes and places of interest there. And she also offered many, as she called them, folkloric details for my story, which I appreciate, and read the manuscripts and corrected them and many times. So for all of that, thank you, Nelly. I'm planning to just tell you a little bit about the book just as an introduction, and then I may read a little bit. Actually, I'm going to share my screen in a moment, and yeah, actually, maybe I'll just do that right now, because I might as well show what I'm talking about. So I'm going to see how this goes. So this is the book, Village of Scoundrels, and it's based on the true story of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon and other villages that were located on a high plateau. Oh, I forgot about this slide, but many of you may have just recently heard this story in the news about a man who bequeathed apparently £2 million to that very French village that sheltered him from the Nazis as a child. So if you'd heard that story, this is the village that we're talking about right now. As I said, it's located on a high plateau in South Central France, and that remoteness is probably one thing that helped them to enable them to shelter many hundreds of Jewish refugees, many of them children and teens who had been rescued from French concentration camps. And there's a picture of some of the children who had been rescued mixed in with the village children. They stayed in boarding houses in the village that had already been set up because it was considered a very healthy place to go. And children from down in the valley were, sorry, what things are happening around here. Would come up to the village to get healthy. This is before the war, but during the war, the village took the opportunity to then use those spaces to shelter these Jewish children and teenagers. Since I write for young readers, I was very interested in the teenagers that got involved with the rescue effort and the sheltering effort, and both those who did that and some of the children who were sheltered there. This is Nelly's family, and Nelly, you can introduce your family here.
All right. This is my father, André Truckman, who was half French, half German. This is my mother, Nelly Magda Grilli di Cortona, who was half Italian, half Russian. And this is the family. My little brother, Daniel, next brother, Jacques, next brother, Jean-Pierre, and then myself with wonderful hand-knit long stockings.
What color, do you remember what
beige.
color they were?
Sort of beige, and I had
Okay.
my school coat on, my school jacket, and it was black and unpleasant. See, I was the oldest. Yeah.
Nelly's father, Andre, is a character in my story, and both her parents were very instrumental. They both did shelter Jews in their home, and also inspired the others to do the same thing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in a reading. So now I've pressed too many buttons and I can't seem to make anything happen.
You're looking for the next picture?
Oh no, I'm trying to get the picture to change, but I clicked to the wrong thing, and so nothing is happening. I might have to stop and start over again. Let's try that again. Sorry for the delay. Okay, so some of the characters in my story, they're based on real people. Oscar Rosowski, who in my story is named Jean-Paul, he at 17 years old forged his first paper, and it was a document that helped to get his mother out of Rivesaltes internment camp. And he and his mother then were able to be sheltered on the plateau, and he began forging many, many documents for the Jewish refugees who were sheltered there and needed to have some kind of an identity, and or needed to go to Switzerland and needed documents in order to do that. This young boy, Paul Mazet, delivered papers for Oscar, and he also shows up in my story as a Jules. Pierre Piton was also only 17 when he began smuggling people over the border to Switzerland. And he would put on his Boy Scout uniform. He looked very young. And so he would get away with shepherding people right up to the Swiss border. Took quite a long train ride to accomplish that. These two were sheltered on the plateau. Hannah and Max Liebman met and fell in love in a French concentration camp, an internment camp, and were rescued or extracted from the camp. They ended up on the plateau together, and they were eventually made it to Switzerland and were married. And because of Nelly, I was able to interview them in their home in Queens as I was starting to research this book. Max has unfortunately since passed away. And it is one of the reasons why I really felt kind of an urgency about writing this story, is to get these stories down while the people who experienced the real thing still are alive. And then we come to Catherine. Nelly, you can say her last name.
Okay. Well, this is I, right here.
You are in here, I'll show you. This is Nelly.
Yeah, this is I, right here on the left.
Yes.
It was actually taken after the war, but I look like young enough so that I can pass for the war times. This is my friend Marco d'Arcissac, whose father was arrested with my father and put in a French concentration camp for a month. He was in the armed underground. And this is my friend Catherine Cambecedes-Colburn, who is 96 and lives in California. And Catherine is an interesting person. She's very funny. She knows a lot of stories. And I told Margi, you got to speak to Catherine. And so Catherine told her a bunch of stories of things she had done during the war. Things that I never heard of, because you will know that the people who did help the refugees never boasted about it. Once the war was finished, they left the stories behind and started a new life doing other things. And that's what Catherine did. She came to the States, she married an American and lives in California, went to Mills College and, taught French at Stanford in part. And she had all these adventures during the war, which she had never told me about. And it is because Margi interviewed her that through Margi, I learned what Catherine did during the war.
That's so interesting. And thank you for introducing me to her, because she really is a wonderful and interesting person and a lot of fun to talk to. She told me, I'm going to read a little bit because you suggested that I read some of her story. And I'll just introduce it by saying that she became a courier for the French resistance. And she told me that she didn't think she was very good at it because she was very afraid. And of course, that interested me very much, that she would do it anyway, even though she was so afraid. So, it is also because of one of the questions that I had while I was writing this story, which is, what makes some people willing to risk their lives to help others? And especially when they're so afraid to do it. So I'm going to read, she's taking a message to a contact in the resistance. And I'm just going to read a short little bit about what happened to her on one of her her journeys. A tiny slip of tissue paper, a tiny slip of paper so dangerous that if military police made a check on the train, she was to swallow it. Celeste sat on the edge of her seat on the train, jiggling her knees or trying not to jiggle them, gnawing her fingernails or trying not to gnaw them. She imagined a pulsing glow emitting from her left foot where the message was tucked into her stocking. Unexpectedly, the train came to a halt. An alert sounded and the cry went out. Bombers overhead. Allez-y, get going, people shouted as they hurried to evacuate. They practically climbed over one another in their scramble to get off the train. Celeste joined the crush of passengers stumbling over the tracks, her consciousness still focused on the imagined pressure of the paper against her left ankle. The roar of the approaching airplane's engines sent everyone into the brush that lined the tracks. Crouched with the others, Celeste squeezed her eyes shut as the planes roared overhead. The bombs whistled down and exploded in a series of deafening blasts, each blast shaking the ground under them and producing clouds of dust, smoke, and debris. Instead of covering her ears as she should have, she clutched her ankles as if to protect that little piece of paper. After just a few frightening moments, the planes roared away and a strange quiet resumed, a fuzzy emptiness in her head. Next time, cover your ears, someone shouted at her, though his voice sounded distant and murky. So she has to continue on her way by finding trains and buses and a circuitous route that takes several days to get to the village where she will make a contact who will take her to the person that she is to deliver this message to. And on the train, she does have to swallow that message too. But she makes it. And she meets her contact who, and they have to go 40 kilometers to meet the person she's to deliver the message to on a tandem bike. And it's 11 o'clock at night when they start. Through the sleeping village they went, the ticking of their tires echoing against the walls of the stone houses. Soon the road passed between a row of plane trees, and for a few moments, the bicycle coasted among the shadows, then shot out into moonlit countryside, past the shuttered windows of sleeping farmhouses, past the dark lumps of cows lying in fields, past horses quietly swishing their tails. It was lovely to be awake and alive in the night, moving through the lavender and thyme-scented air. Words from one of her pastor's sermons came back to her. It was something she thought of often since that day, the day after France surrendered to Germany on June 22nd, 1940. And maybe I'll just stop here to say, this is Nelly's father, who is the pastor, and the words that he speaks are his actual words. It had been a Sunday, and outside the church, people wandered about like hens with a certain aimlessness of purpose, as if they didn't know what to do or where to go. Go inside or stay outside, blinking in the June sun. Everyone wondering, now that France had capitulated and Germany was occupying the northern part of France, what would happen here? Surely the government here will have to collaborate with the Nazis. This is what people were saying, but what everyone was feeling was, what will become of us? Will we be engulfed in war? Will the tanks and bombs and machine guns find their way even here? Are we to be ruled by a totalitarian regime, by fascists? And who will we be in the face of this horror? Celeste was nearly vaporous with fear. Her mind, like everyone else's, was whirling with anxiety and questions. How her legs carried her into the church, she couldn't say. Somehow she found herself inside, the familiarity of the cool granite slabs underfoot, helping to tamp down the anxiety. I'm realizing that I have a picture of the church. So that's the outside and the inside. Both pastors were there in full pastoral dress, indicating their solidarity in whatever was going to be said. When Pastor Autant climbed the stairs to the pulpit, the congregation fell silent. And when he began to speak, you could have heard a pin drop. We must be on our guard against believing and spreading the word that all is lost, he said. It is not true that all is lost. Gospel truth is not lost. The word of God is not lost. Faith is not lost. Celeste pressed her eyes shut. All is not lost, she repeated. The duty of Christians, Pastor Autant said, is to resist the violence directed at our consciences with the weapons of the Spirit. We must do our duty without conceding defeat, without servility, without cowardice. We will resist when our enemies demand that we act in ways that go against the teachings of the gospel. We will resist without fear, without pride, and without hatred. We will resist, Celeste whispered to herself, without fear. After that sermon, Celeste had felt calm. Here was someone who knew what to do. Even if the whole world had gone mad, there was one man who knew what was right and was determined to live it. She felt a sense of purpose. She felt that everyone felt the same way, although no one spoke of it again. They simply began to live it. And this is what I want to put to you, Nelly, is because for one thing, you said that Catherine had not shared what she was doing. And you have also mentioned to me that people did not talk to each other about what they were doing. And yet, by some accounts, practically everyone in the village had sheltered someone at some point or another, or in some of the small villages anyway, in that area. So can you talk a little bit about that? How that was?
Well, if you are running a secret organization, which is an organization of resistance to the government, you don't talk. It is silent. It is like an underground network. Contacts are made from A to B, B to C, C to D, but there is no relationship between A and D. So it was all it was all secret. And I didn't know what Catherine was doing, although she was a friend of mine, but she was a little older. She was 3 years older. So she had that life of hers, which was different from mine, because I did not join the resistance. I was too young. You know, at 14, 15, she was 17, 18, I don't know exactly what. And and the thing that's extraordinary is that everything was secret. There was no office, no director, no organization, no planning. It was all underground and spontaneous, with contacts made orally. There was no writing lists of anything. It was all oral. So there was nothing to grab onto. And today, there are no papers about that, no documents. This is the only way an operation can remain secret, just
Right.
not to talk. And it was not difficult for the local people, because many of them were of a peasant background and very silent peasant, not talkative people, very reserved, you know, mountain people. And so it was almost a natural thing. In the village, there were some people who did not hide refugees.
Right.
There were some people, I can name a few, a couple of old Catholics, but they knew of other people who hid refugees, and they never told the police. So it was a way of resisting, if you want. They didn't act themselves, but they protected their friends by not denunciation.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, one thing that's also interesting is that even after the war, the villagers didn't really talk about what they had done.
It was finished. Nobody talked about it. Nobody said what they had done. It was past. It was passé. It was finished until a Jewish American professor of ethics at Wesleyan University discovered the story. And he became wild about it because he was so depressed by the negative aspect of war and killing. And he was on the border of suicide, actually. His name was Philip Halley. Mm-hmm. And Philip Halley, professor at Wesleyan University, went for the story 100%. Oh, you have the book here. Called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. Well, his rabbi told him that's the title he should give. That is, to me, a mouthful. He discussed it with me. I said, well, Mother always said, come in, but come in. She would open the door when there were refugees. That's what should be the title of the book. Then he went to his rabbi, and the rabbi said, no, it should be Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed.
So dramatic.
And but Philip Halley put his story is very romantic, and it lost its importance, but
it made it more public, more people learned about the story that way.
It put the story on the map. No one had written about it before, and right. Philip Halley was the first one to write about it.
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions, Nelly, and one of them is, how old was Celeste when she was doing this work? Here comes my footman.
She must have been about 18.
She was what?
18.
18, yeah. Okay, in my story, she's 16 because,
well, we see,
fiction.
Your story has its feature. Yeah. And of course, you have manipulated many things. There were no bombings of trains on the plateau at all, but you had that bombing going on, No, your story is feature, but it's based on true stories.
Yeah.
And she was not 16, she was 18.
Right. Another question is about the influence of the Huguenots. And I did want to get into that because I didn't mention that the village was mostly Protestant, and it was Huguenot Protestant. So there was that background and that history of persecution that the Huguenots had suffered, like centuries earlier, but they hadn't forgotten. And don't you think that was part of the desire to help others was recognized?
Everybody thinks about that because the Huguenots, when some of the French people adopted what they call the new faith, which was the Reformation, the Protestant faith, under Calvin, John Calvin. The French government, the kings and the church, who worked like this, very friendly, were very threatened by those Huguenots, who actually were hardworking, middle class, intelligent, honest. They were a whole population that scared the government because they were a threat. And so the Huguenots were actually persecuted. It was a regular genocide, absolutely, en masse. They were hung, they were sent to row on boats. There was a phenomenon on the Saint Bartholomew Day. Who knows about that Saint Bartholomew massacre? Well, it was when in Paris, the Queen ordered that all the Huguenots people knew should be thrown out the windows. And they were. It was a regular defenestration event where people were thrown out the window to die on the pavement. So it was a terrible time. And so the descendant of these people, some of them came to the States. The pilgrims who came, many of them were Huguenots. They went to England, they went to Germany. The Germans loved the Huguenots. They gave them land because they were good farmers. The German princes loved the Huguenots. But the ones who were not smart enough.
You're talking about centuries earlier,
right?
And so do you think but they still remember that heritage of theirs?
Okay, the ones who couldn't flee took refuge in very isolated places.
Yeah.
And the plateau was one of those places, which explains that the population, which is something very rare in France, was in great part Protestant, while France is a Catholic country. And so those Protestants remember their stories of persecution, and they kept that tradition of protecting the people who needed it. During the revolution, they even protected Catholic priests that were persecuted by the new government of the revolution that suppressed religion. The priests hid on the plateau. The Huguenots hid them because there were people in need. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Right.
And so during the war, when refugees started arriving, it was sort of a normal continuation of the idea that you help those who need it. Because our ancestors were persecuted and they could use help, and the tradition of helping came through to the present.
Okay, I'm following the chat over here a little bit. So I want to say that we're getting the message that Catherine was 16, born in the fall 1924. This is from her daughter, who ought to know. So I guess I was closer in age at that time. And then there's some really great questions here. So I hope I'm not missing any as they go by. But there are a couple questions about how we met. And that is a fun story. So, because one of them is, did you know Nelly before you started doing your research for the book? No, I didn't. Did you meet her while you were doing your research? If you knew her before, yeah. So I didn't know you.
How did you get my name?
What?
How did you get my name?
I got your name from from a friend who knows everything about the internet, and apparently it really wasn't that hard to find you and your phone number. So I called you up, and you weren't there, and I left a message on your machine, and I thought, she's never going to call me back. And in the meantime, you can pick it up from there.
So I have been assailed by goofballs, what I call goofballs, who want to write musicals, who want to write operas. The Hallmark Hall of Fame wanted to make a film. I turned them down. There was a Japanese who wrote me. He dropped it because I discouraged him. And then so I am very choosy about people who want to write something about that very special story. So I get this phone call from this unknown lady. I said, well, I can't not answer. I'm going to try. So I called this person called Margi Preus from Duluth, mind you. And
I should point out, Nelly, let me interrupt you to say you live in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Yeah, I live in St. Paul. Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
I am in St. Paul. So I talked to her gently and said, it was strange that you're interested in this story. How did you hear about it? What did you read about it? And she said, well, I did some research. And I said, well, did you read this book? She said, oh, yes, I did. And that other book? She said, oh, yes, I read that too. I thought, this woman is not a goofball. She's a real researcher. She's worth working with. So I said, well, let's meet. And so she came down to meet me in St. Paul. Meanwhile, I made a beeline for Red Balloon where I had friends. And I said, do you know a Margi Preus? And they said, oh, do we know her? We sell her books all over the place. I said, good. And then I looked on the internet, and of course, it was a lovely picture of her. She's a beautiful lady. And all the books she had already written, and the book on samurai, for which she got a Newbery Prize. And so I knew she was a serious writer. And so from there on, we started working together. And as I said, my contribution was to tell her about details of her teenage life in the village during the war. Such as, I don't know, you can speak about that. Do you remember some of those details?
I was sorry, I got sort of distracted reading the questions. Well, actually, I know this story.
But details on the food, on the wood,
yeah.
the wooden clogs we wore, because we had we were allowed tickets for only one pair of shoes a year. And when you are a growing child or a growing teenager, very soon you outgrow your shoes. So we all wore wooden clogs, and wooden clogs in the snow. I tell you, then snow packs underneath, so you walk like this, and we walked to school, 2-3 miles. But we were used to it. And then we didn't have those wonderful warm ski jackets. We were country people. We were poor, and so we had Loden capes. Loden is a nice warm fabric. We had Loden capes, but they got wet in the snow going to school or in the rain. And then we'd come home, and then there was no heat, so the Loden didn't really dry. And so pretty soon everybody smelled like wet dogs all the time. We all smelled like wet dogs. And that's okay.
Then there are some people who in the chat who know what you're talking about, that les sabots, someone says.
Les sabots is a wooden clogs.
And riding on sleds in the winter, that's another, somebody's asking about that. But before we get to that, I want to get to this other question before it disappears, which is, did you as a child, as a young teenager, were you aware of the danger that your family was in, that your parents
We were conscious and very aware, because the situation of the political situation was discussed at my home at the dinner table. My parents spoke very freely of what was happening, what the BBC was talking about. It was forbidden to listen to the BBC, but we were in the boonies, so we could listen to the BBC without any problem. We saw refugees arrive. We were informed of refugees. We started being informed on persecution. Concentration camps were not really well known then. It was the beginning of the concentration camps. At the beginning of the war, we didn't know about concentration camps. And little by little, we were informed about everything that was happening. We were not worried because we, the children, were convinced that our parents were doing the right thing and that somehow it would turn out okay.
And then, but your father was arrested.
He was arrested by the French police, not the German police, the French police.
Was that less scary?
My father, his colleague, Edouard Theiss, and the head of the public school, Roger Darcissac, the three, they were arrested. And after 1 month, orders came to release them. And they were presented by a paper saying that they should sign their allegiance to Maréchal Pétain, the government, the chief of the French government. And Darcissac, who was a state employee, had to sign because his salary and feeding his children depended on his salary. He had to sign. He wasn't faithful to the government, but he signed anyway. The two ministers didn't sign. They said, no, we can't do that. We have been arrested because of our beliefs. We are not going to compromise our beliefs just to get out of camp. And so they were at the gate, ready to go out, and they were told, you can't go out, back to the barracks. And they were sent back to the barracks. They were there only 24 hours. And orders came from Vichy, from the government, to release those two men who were ministers and, innocent pacifists. They were not throwing bombs on the railroad tracks because the Germans were traveling on the railroads. So the orders came to liberate them anyway. So they didn't sign and they were liberated. And soon after that, the camp was closed and all the residents were deported.
Yeah.
So something happened that they didn't want those two men to be deported and be heroes of nonviolence.
There's a question here too about whether your father was under more scrutiny because he was a pastor.
What? I didn't get that.
What? The question is, was your was your dad as the pastor under more scrutiny than someone else?
He became under scrutiny more and more. They all became under scrutiny. And being a charismatic catalyst for that nonviolent hiding of Jews, he became more and more overseen, checked by the police. So that finally, Actually, there was a policeman that was sent to the village. We had no police in the village, you know. The first police was 8 kilometers down the hill. So there was no one in charge, really. And the French government sent a policeman to observe the village, to see where were the Jews hiding, who they were, and so forth and so on. His name was Prali. In your book, he's perdant. Perdant from perdre, which means lose. Lose. So he's called loser in her book, perdant. But his name was Prali. And Prali was very disliked, and people were careful with him, although he had a French girlfriend in the village. And one day he just walked out of his hotel to do his job, and 2 guys came on bicycle, probably underground people, shot him dead, pow, and then hopped on their bicycle and disappeared in the woods. And you know what? No one ever bothered to find out who killed Prali, because everybody was very happy that he was gone.
So
in those war years, there were unjustified killings all the time anyway.
I'm jumping a little bit because there's a question here about the Jules, or Yule. Jules is the way we'd say it here. So who is the little boy in my story who leads the officer you're talking about, the policeman, astray to keep him away from what's going on. And the question is, in my afterward, I tell about the real people, and I don't really know anything about the boy that I based. Jules is a very, very fictional character.
Totally fictional. Totally fictional.
Totally fictional, except that there was.
So is that castle. So is that castle.
Yeah, the castle. The chateau that's a fiction too. Yeah. But it's all based on something, because like Virginia Hall, and if any of you have read A Woman of No Importance about Virginia Hall, she also plays a small part in my story, because this is where she was doing some of her work and setting up parachute drops. And she's an American. For those of you who haven't read the book or don't know, Virginia Hall was an American who was working as a spy for the British in France. And she was on the plateaus, and she was in Le Chambon and in that area.
And the Germans identified her because she limped.
Yeah, she had a wooden leg.
Of an elegant background, and on a hunting trip somewhere in Romania or Hungary, she had shot herself in the leg. So she had a wooden leg. Yeah. And in spite of that, she was a spy, and a very good spy. And the Germans were looking for her like a pin in a haystack, could never find her. And part of the time she was on the plateau near Le Chambon, never in Le Chambon. I never met the woman. I never knew about her, because she was in the world of the violent resistance. Yeah. And I lived in the world of the rescue of Jews and civil disobedience. Yeah,
there were really 2 different kinds of things going on there. And there was a lot of resistance activity there because of its remoteness and the proximity to the mountains. The Maquis, they could just disappear up into the into the mountains quickly, and there were a lot of old barns and things to hide in, I think.
And so that was farms. There were farms everywhere, you know, and there were. It was a good place to hide for the resistance, like for the refugees.
Right. So I'm going to try to address just a couple more questions. One was back a ways, but I didn't want to let it go by, was what age group is the book for? And it is considered, I don't know, it's shelved in middle grade or YA. So I would say for, age 10 and up. There's not really any horrible violence in it. No. So it's not, you don't have to worry about that for a younger reader. But most of the characters are in their late teens, 16, 17 and up. And so they're a little bit older. There was the sledding question, Nelly. Somebody wanted to know if you were one of those sledders. There's
yes, I was, and it was forbidden. My parents didn't like it at all. Then when my father was hidden for 10 months, mother had not strong control over me. By then I was an older teenager and I didn't do sledding. We used to sled through the village because the village was on a hill and it was wonderful. Here, look at that. You see the sleds we have? Those sleds. You have a first person on his stomach hooking on the second sled. Okay, so that was a sled train. And sometimes on the second sled would also be a fellow on his stomach hooking a third sled. And that was dangerous. And the last sled always had 1 or 2 people sitting. But if it was 3 sleds, it went, it did this. And so the fellow on his stomach had to straighten out with his legs. It was work.
And this to show how steep the streets were.
This is the way I went to elementary school.
And this is where the kids were sledding, for those of you who have...
One of the places. No, it's not the main place where they were sledding. They were sledding on the streets where the snow was plowed. So that's why it was dangerous. And it wasn't straight. There was a big curve.
And there's some kids having a snowball fight. Just thought I'd throw that in there. Okay.
The sledding parties were wonderful, and we would start way up on the hill, and it was at night, and so that we didn't want to run over anybody, so we would yell, "Oh!" as we passed. We passed someone. The tone of it's like the ambulances, here change pitch when they pass a certain degree, a certain level. And it was forbidden. And so we had it's not a policeman. We didn't have a policeman. There was a town guard who did all sorts of odd jobs. And one of his jobs was to try to prevent us from sledding. And so he would go and put ashes all over the streets. He had buckets and he would spread the ashes so that you can't slide on ashes at all. So we waited until he was gone, and we had brooms hidden in the village, in halls, in entrances, in corners. We take our brooms and brush away the ashes.
You were a scoundrel. You said you were a scoundrel, but you were a scoundrel
that way. Yeah, that was, yes. We swept the ashes away and went, whoa. And of course, when we crossed a railroad track with the sleds, which had metal runners, there were sparks. It was impressive in the night, big sparks.
Do you know that is one thing that I had to have a little argument with a copy editor about, or an editor, or I forget, somebody challenged me on that because I have sparks fly as the sled runners go over the tracks. And they said, no, that would never happen. And I said, well, I heard it from the horse's mouth.
It made sparks because the railroad tracks were level with the street going down the hill, okay? And the sleds had metal runners. And when they hit the tracks, it was iron on iron, and it made sparks.
By the way, your daughter is calling you a scoundrel in the chat.
Where?
If you hit your little chat, thing on the bottom, you'll see what everybody's saying.
I don't see it.
Okay, you'll just have to trust me then. And then
a daughter of mine is calling me a scoundrel?
Yeah, Katya.
Katya?
Yeah.
Oh, here, from Katya Blackburn, everyone.
And I've been called a goofball, so I guess we're 2 for 2 on that. Yeah. So somebody had asked now I've lost. Can I go back? Oh, I can. Oh, that's nice. How did you decide how to focus all these stories and information to choose your overall question? And that was really a challenge because there were so many people who were involved, right. And I really felt like they all needed their stories told so that you could see how all of these different people working together, and yet not knowing even that they were necessarily working together, made this all happen. And so I chose the people that I just showed you in the pictures as the characters that I would write about, since they each had their role. The people smuggler, the forger, and somebody else had mentioned here that there was a regular factory.
And you have them identified. At the end of the book, what Margi did is that she, after giving all these phony names to these people whom she uses and manipulates in a story that is very close to reality, but not quite real because it's fiction, at the end, she gives a picture of the real people and their real name. So that's nice.
Yeah, and I try to tell their real story, and and the people I was able to contact, I had them read their little biography, and
you have photos. I mean, it's nice. I have the book here.
But it was a hard book to structure, because having that many characters and then trying to weave those stories together and not lose track, you know, not spend too much time with one so that you lose track of another.
Sure.
So, but that was that. And as for the question, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I always write from questions, or, you know, a major question. And in this one, I think, you know, why are people willing to risk their lives? That's one thing. The other question is about young people really taking on these huge challenges, and being
young people, older teenagers,
but they're still young people.
Yes.
You think of them as grown-ups, and I think that if they're 17, they're still a teenager and they're still young.
Well, you know, Piton, the one who smuggled people.
Right.
I knew him well. He was a scout. He pretended he was a student at the school. He never was there. He was just a sort of a scoundrel, a real scoundrel. He was. But he had guts. He had no fear. He had guts, and he would not hesitate to take the challenge of taking people on the way to Switzerland.
And that's one of the great things about young people. And one of the things that I felt very deeply while I was writing this was the parallels that I see with young people, young activists today, and in Black Lives Matter, with climate change, with gun control. These are driven a lot with young activists, and part of it is that no fear, you know, and energy and passion. So all of those things were things that I had in mind as I was writing the story.
You know, and all the civil rights marches with Martin Luther King and all that, these fellows who were killed, who went south. One was a Jew. 3 young men who were arrested because they were trying to break the laws of segregation in the South. And they entered a restaurant and sat there, and they never were served. It's, I don't remember their name. I'm sorry. I'm terrible with names.
Nelly, somebody's brought up that, and I'm glad, I'm very glad. Oh, actually, I think it's Mary, my sister-in-law. I understand that Syrian refugees have recently been welcomed in Le Chambon.
Well, you know, there are centers in France of people who are waiting for their papers in order to be able to work. And many are Syrian, okay? They are called, they are all over France, and they are run by the government, but they are still housed in different towns. And we have one of those centers in Le Chambon right now. And the women are Muslims, you know, we're there. And they go, the kids go to school for free. And I don't know, they are fed, I suppose, by the town for free. And they are waiting for their papers. Since they had nothing much to do, they keep having children. That's the problem.
Yeah, I know that the village has continued to welcome refugees, and I think that's
well, they do. The Syrians are welcome, and they have that center for them.
Yeah.
It's not so much the individual families. Some individual families, yeah, some. In another town, Le Mazet, just a few miles away from the Chambon. But yes, we always have had refugees in the Chambon, let's face it.
There's a couple more questions that I could combine, and I would love to talk about this. How did you find the village to write about, and how long did the entire process of completing the book take? So I'm going to just tell about how I found out about the village. Okay. And I was researching Shadow on the Mountain, which is another historical fiction book based on a real person, a kid who got involved in the resistance in Norway during World War II. And that book came out or I was writing it in 2011, I guess, and it came out in 2012. So while I was researching that book, I ran across this little snippet somewhere on the internet that told about a village in France that sheltered Jewish children. And when the gendarmes would come hunting, they would send the children out into the forest to pick mushrooms or blueberries. Well, in other words, to hide. And then when the gendarmes went away after not finding them, the village children would go out into the forest and sing a little song to let the hidden children know that it was safe to come back. I know. Just wait a minute though. You can have your say, but I want to say, so because this story was in France, I just thought it was very interesting, but I tucked it away because I was writing a book about Norway. But then in 2016 or 2017, let's say, when we got a new administration, and we won't say anything more about that, but I was very depressed, and I was supposed to be writing another novel, but I honestly felt like, what can I write about? It just felt like there was nothing to be done. Then I remembered that little snippet, and I thought, those people, I want to write about good people doing the right thing. And so I went in search of learning more about wherever that little village was. And I came across all the books that you were mentioning before. And because it's not an unknown place, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have read other books or know people or have been there.
It's not that known, but since that gift of 2 million euros in France, all of a sudden it's known. But the French really don't know that story. They didn't know that story in general.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, that was how I got started writing it. And so that was in 2017. So that answers the question of how long it took. But it also takes a very long time now with a book. You get an advanced reading copy. For this book was out a year before the actual book came out. So there's a long process of the whole thing. Oh, there's so many.
And we had a discussion with your publisher. The place is full of green pine trees and blue streams and daffodils in the spring and Dutch broom and I had this picture of idea of a cover that would represent the countryside. They did a baby blue cover. The baby blue cover, which has nothing to do with the area.
Nelly hates the cover.
They wouldn't budge. Margi tried, and no, their mind was made up. They have artists, who mill out the pictures. That's okay.
Well, Nelly, there's all kinds of questions and comments here. I hope you will be able to see some of them. But I think we have just time for just one more, says Wendy. Oh, there's Wendy. So I'm just scrolling through because I missed a lot of this. This is great. Somebody wanted to know how you ended up in the US, Nelly. Do you want to just do a
Oh,
quick?
I don't think that's important.
Not important.
I ended up, oh, I can tell you, I landed up in St. Paul, Minneapolis because of a husband who had a position, who was a resident at the university. And so that's how I did know where Minnesota was. All I knew, I had learned in school that there was a Mississippi and there were elevators for grain. That's all I knew. So I arrived here for 3 years of residency and I never left. And my first husband is listening right now. He and his wife were going to listen tonight. Hi.
You better say hi to a whole bunch of people. There's people that know you, Nelly, that are saying.
This morning when I was on another video Zoom visit with a class in at Columbia University in New York, there were more people there on the screen whom I recognized. And it was fun because I could identify them. I identify them by name. It was fun.
I think we should both say thank you to all the wonderful people that came and their comments and questions, and for joining us this evening. I really appreciate it. It was fun to see the comments and always great to talk with you, Nelly.
From Katia Blackburn, from Janine. Oh, I missed my daughter's comments. It goes too fast.
She can tell you later.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for being here tonight. I'm so happy to have taken the night off to listen to the two of you have a conversation about your story, the book. It's just been wonderful.
Well, it is a fun book to read, even for adults, really.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, that's a great way to end.
Yes. And I will be sending out, if you've read, obviously you're here, if you've registered, I will send out a link if you need to watch this again and enjoy a wonderful evening.
I think it's on Kindle, isn't it, Margi? Isn't the book on Kindle?
Probably. And there's an audio book as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this friend in St. Paul who wanted the book from the library, I told you she couldn't get it because there was a waiting list.
Hold list. So yes.
Your
Get on
library.
it, people.
All right.
Get it at Red Balloon. Okay.
Red Balloon. Next chapter has a page set up. Red Balloon will have it.
Sponsor the Red Balloon. The Red Balloon. It's a wonderful store.
They partner, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, on the Minnesota Book Awards every year. They're a great.
Well, we were supposed to have an opening at the Red Balloon, Margi and I. And it was canceled because of the virus. Yeah. Of course, life is all changed because of that stupid virus. Dangerous virus.
All right.
Okay.
All the best to both of you. Thank you again, audience, for your attention. We've got one more fireside reading next week with Hyde Erdrich, and I hope many of you will tune in then. Have a good night.
Thank you.